We're in the book of Philippians, where we are looking at just how God, through His gospel, changes everything about us. And that's a very interesting thing, because living in a world where science tells us that all things move from order to chaos, that's not the way it works in the life of Christ. With Christ in us, we don't move from things that are ordered to more chaotic. We actually move into more ordered life through Christ. And so that's what the book of Philippians talks about. It's an encouraging book. And so it starts out just talking about this. And then as he gets into chapter 1, he talks more specifically about how the gospel changes our perspective and how we see hardships and how we see sufferings. That all changes because of the gospel. We look at how the gospel inspires us to walk worthy, inspires us to walk in a manner of unity with one another and in the midst of suffering. It inspires us. And we see how the gospel brings us together in that unity and that it allows us to regard others as more important than ourselves. We saw that in the first part of chapter 2. And then last week when we came together, we talked about how the gospel changes our attitude. We saw this beautiful example of Jesus Christ, how He did not regard equality with God something to be held on to, but He gave it up, took on the form of a man, gave His life, even to the point of death, He humbled Himself. And that we are to have this same attitude. So He gives us this beautiful picture of how the gospel changes our attitude, which brings us to today. See, after you see a beautiful picture of Christ and He encourages us to change our attitude, He then has to tell us how to do it, right? And that's what today's about. It's about how does the gospel, and what are the things that the gospel does that helps us to live every day? How do we see the gospel in our everyday life? Now, if you're like me, you probably love to do stuff around your house, right? You love to tear stuff apart, fix the sink, tear the car apart, right? Anybody know? Or do you hire that stuff out, right? You call somebody to come do it. Well, unfortunately, I'm the guy that I'm serious about that. I don't necessarily like to hire it out if I can do it, which means that there's a lot of stuff that's not finished at my house. But it's interesting. We don't live, 20 years ago, if I wanted to work on my car, if I wanted to tear it apart, I was going to break something. I was going to mess it up, because here's what you would do. You have no training, right? I'm not a mechanic. And I'd start taking stuff off. I'd buy a little book from an auto parts store, a little Chilton's or a little Haynes manual, which are never accurate. They're never right. And I'd start going through it and going, this doesn't look like this. And you're looking at the picture, and you're looking at the diagram and the thing, and it's not ever matches up. And then you call a mechanic to come get your car and take it to his shop and fix it. That's not how it's done today. Today, it's different. You go get the manual, you kind of get you look at a diagram, but then you Google it. You Google it, right? How do I fix the transmission on my truck? And you know what you're going to get? You're going to get not only a description of what to do, you're going to get a video. Hallelujah for YouTube. You want to fix your sink? You Google it. How do I fix my sink? And you're going to get a video, and you're going to go to YouTube, and it's going to have, you're going to get to pick from like 3 or 4 different things. My faucet doesn't work. You can even select the type of faucet you have, and they'll literally show you a diagram on how to do it. And you can do this for anything. My lawnmower, my refrigerator, my microwave, my kid's appendix ruptured. How do I take it out? And they'll show you. It's wonderful. We no longer live in an age where you can't do it. So you get the manual, you read it, you watch the video, and then you go and you get to work. And 9 times out of 10, you'll fail. But that 10th time, it's glorious, right? The reason I tell you that is because we need that stuff in our everyday life to live, to kind of get through things. It's great to have these wonderful examples of what to do. It's great to have the diagram, the manual. You can go now and download just about any manual to anything. You remember your TV? You remember your VCR that you couldn't program the clock on? The microwave that's still blinking 12 in your house? I'm going to help you out. All you got to do is Google it. And they'll show you a video of how to set that dadgum clock. And your wife will thank you for it. See, there's a manual, and then there's this example, and then you go and do. And what's funny is that's what we see in the Bible. Jesus told his disciples what to do. He lived them, and he walked them, and he gave them example, and he told them to go do it. And as we talk about how the gospel changes us, we get intimidated. Very intimidated, like a guy walking up to a car engine for the first time, like somebody walking up to something in their house that they've never had to work on before, and now they're having to do it. We get intimidated, and we quickly run for the phone to call an expert. Well, can I tell you, even the experts aren't experts. God's given you the ability to be his hands and feet. You, as the Christian, are on mission for him. And there's no hotline you call. You don't call me. You don't call the pastor, the professional. I'm not a professional. You don't call somebody else. No, it's intimidating, but you step in the gap. And that's what happened to the disciples. And that's what Paul is talking about to the Philippian church. As the gospel changes us, there becomes this moment in time where we just have to step out and do. So what we're going to go through now is what I would call the manual. That's why I called this part 1. The gospel in our everyday lives, part 1, because this is the manual part. He's going to give us some tools, some philosophical concepts, and some practical things that we as Christians, as people who are in the gospel, who've been affected by the gospel, and whose lives are now changed, we've seen something because of Christ. He's given us a manual now. We're going to walk through just a few things that we need to know. And then next week, we're going to hit part 2. We're going to go to YouTube. Well, not really YouTube, but Paul's going to give us 3 examples from 3 different men throughout their life and show you characteristics of how this stuff looks in their lives. And that's what's going to be next week. So this week we're going to start with the first part. This is coming off of a text where we see Christ, a beautiful example of his humility, of him putting others above himself, of him taking on the form of a servant and going to the cross to the point of death. And that gets us right into this next part, which is verse 12. So if you grab your Bible, look in Philippians. We're going to start in verse 12 of chapter 2. C.S. Lewis had a quote that we mentioned last week. He said this: "True humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less." True humility is not self-deprivation. You did not see in the text above this where Christ all of a sudden thinks of himself less. He doesn't all of a sudden become less God. He doesn't take the power that he has and give it up. He just submits himself to the Father in that he will no longer manifest it until God as a human. He submits that, surrenders that to him. He doesn't stop being God fully. He doesn't stop being man fully. He doesn't think of himself, he's not thinking of himself less. But what he does is he puts his desires aside. And that's where we are today. So the question we have to ask going into this is, how do we think of ourselves less? Not less of ourselves, but of ourselves less. And I believe that's where the text really lends itself. That's where we're going to see some of the goods in the text. So the first thing we see right off the bat, the first thing you're going to see is, how do we live this out every day? We do this by working out our salvation. We work out our salvation. Now, I want to focus on one quick thing here. We work out our salvation. Look at the text, verse 12. It says, "So then, my beloved." The reason he's saying "so then" is he's referring back to the text that we just talked about, where Christ humiliates himself. Christ humbles himself, and not humiliation of Christ, because of the laying aside of his own desire, and not seeking equality with God, something to be held on, but he set that aside. "So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed," in other words, just as you have surrendered to the Lord's will in your life, And this is something you've been doing. Not only is in my presence only, but also much more in my absence. Work out your salvation in fear and trembling. Now, I can't tell you how many times people have read this verse, and this verse gets butchered. It gets mutilated. And what we want to do is we want to look at this little text for just a second, and there's three things I want us to pull out. We first have to clarify it, and then we want to explain what it means and how does it look like to work out your salvation. The first thing I want you to see is that we do not work for our salvation. Do you understand? We do not work for our salvation. That's not what this is saying. There are many denominations on this planet, Christian denominations, who read this verse and would say to you that this is your salvation that you have to work out in the sense of you have to work to become saved. Now, the reason this does not say this is very simple, actually. You're not working for your salvation. You're not earning your salvation. You're working it out. You're putting it into practice in a specific way. Now, the reason we know that is two things. The first thing is context. Can I just tell you, the great Bible scholars of the world have a mantra of three words. Context, context, context. You don't just pull this out and go, oh, work out your salvation. This means I have to do something to earn it for God. The Bible is riddled with text that disagree with that. And so we look at the context. The first context is we look at who is this written to? First of all, it's written to the church at Philippi. We've talked about this. These are believers. These are His beloved. He just mentions that. To my beloved, to those who are a part of this family with me. So contextually, we're not talking about non-believers. He's not talking to people who don't know Christ, that they have to work and earn their salvation. That's the first thing you see. If you look at the text above it, he says, just as you have always obeyed. He's not talking to people who don't obey Christ, who haven't obeyed. He says, in my absence, you've obeyed in my presence, and even more in my absence. So we're talking contextually about people who know the Lord. So therefore, this can't be work for or work to earn your salvation. The second thing we always do, and great Bible scholars always do this. Whenever you come to a text in the Bible, this is for all of us, that could be considered a little vague. It could be something that's just not quite as black and white as we want it to be. And I don't believe that this text is. I think there's plenty within this text to show it for what it is. But whenever we come to those texts, what great scholars do, is they verify those texts with much clearer texts. They go throughout other writings. They go to the same author, other books. They go to other authors, other books. They go within the same book. And they look for much stronger texts to verify the vagueness or to clear up the vagueness of the text that's here. So what we could do with this is real simple. Paul, who's writing this, has written many texts on the concept of our salvation. And so when you go to Ephesians 2:8 through 10, we have a text that most of us have memorized before in the past. Look up on your screen, it'll be up there. It says this, for by grace you have been saved through faith. It is not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one can boast. Stop right there before we move on. The point, again, of your salvation is that it is by grace, through faith, you trust, but God has done all the work. You've done no work. God did all the work. Now here's the cool part. The reason is because of God's glory. We have to understand this concept. God is for God. That's tough. We, as humans, want God for me. We're like little kids. My son, my daughter, they want me to be all about them. And I have to say that moments in my life, I am all for them. They become, strangely, somehow very, very, almost the most important thing in our little world, which is wrong. I don't believe that my kids should be the most important thing in our world. But sometimes we as parents, we put them there. And so we feel the same way. That everything that God does is only for man. Now don't get me wrong. I believe God loves us with an undying love. With a love that can't even be fathomed. With a love that can't be measured. I believe that you and I are His beloved. But I want you to know something. I think that God's glory, the reason Jesus went to the cross was for the Father. And our salvation, this is my opinion, that our salvation is absolutely a part of it is intertwined in it. But I believe when you see Christ going to the cross, you see Him in obedience to the will of God, for the glory of God. And our salvation is intertwined in that. That's what I think. So what you can't do here is, we can't go earning our salvation in such a way so that someday we're going to stand before Him and go, look what I did, God. Look what I did for you. Look how good I am. There's not going to be a boasting except in Him. There's not going to be a boasting for me. Now, He will boast for us. That's what you have is known as the judgment seat of Christ. For Christians, He's going to boast on you. Isn't it ugly? Have you ever seen somebody who just goes out and they talk about themselves all the time? Wouldn't you just like them to shut up and give you an opportunity to talk about them? Don't you want to just go, hang on, I know you're good. Stop talking about yourself. Let me talk about you. Let me talk about how good you are. Man, that was awesome. What you did here was so amazing. That's what great managers do. That's what great leaders do, is they step into people's worlds and they glorify them, right? They lift them up. It's not just about you lifting up yourself. And that's what's going to happen. Someday we're not going to stand before God and all of a sudden say, aren't I the greatest, Lord? Haven't I done you such a big favor? He's going to boast in us, right? Because He did everything. He's going to boast for us. Now look at what else this text says. This is what strengthens this concept of we work out our salvation, not for our salvation. He says, for we are His workmanship. In other words, His craftsmanship, His creation, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Wait, what? Not created, we're not saved by good works. We're created for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them. See, for us, we have to understand the concept that this idea of salvation, most people in America, we come to the Lord and we say we've arrived and it's the end of a long journey, right? And I would say absolutely not. It's the beginning. Now the work begins. Christ did everything to get you to this point. He did everything to save you. Now He's going to do everything to divinely enable you to live out His purpose for the reason why He brought you to Himself. The mission of God. Salvation is the beginning, not the end. And so the concept here is that we are learning to work it. We're like the grace that's been given to us, we're now going to use it, to tend it. Okay? So let's look at the next part. So we don't work for our salvation, but we use our salvation to bear fruit. That's this part of it where we actually engage with God in His world, on His mission, and it bears fruit. Do you know what fruit is? Most of us, I think, don't have a right concept of fruit, first of all. I'm sorry. I have an apple tree in my backyard that doesn't produce apples. I don't know why yet. But if it did, most of us say, well, that tree does not produce fruit. But you know that the apple is actually not necessarily the fruit of the tree. The apple is actually the seeds of the tree, right? You think about it. When we talk about us, we talk about the fruit of us. It's our kids, right? It's not our seeds, it's our kids. Fruit is actually the reproduction of a whole nother thing. So the tree that bears fruit is a tree that grows another tree. It drops its acorn out here and another tree grows. It's the reproduction of a complete new thing over here. Not just the husk around the seed that we eat that tastes good. The orange with its seeds inside, that's just the thing that keeps the seeds alive. It keeps the seeds, it protects the seeds while it falls and while it rots, and it nurtures the seeds. We grab it and we eat it. But the fruit is actually the reproduction of another tree. So what do we do with this salvation? What does working it out mean? It means that we use it in such a way that it reproduces. It produces fruit. Look at John 15:8. John 15:8, you see this beautiful picture. Jesus is talking about who He is and who His disciples are supposed to be. He says, my Father is glorified by this. Now think about it. God is glorified that we bear fruit and so prove to be His disciple. Now, if we stop for just a second, I'm going to ask you 4 questions. Because if working out your salvation is the aspect of us using the gift of our salvation, using the grace that God is giving us to reproduce, that means that our purpose on this life at some point involves the gospel. And it involves God. It involves the reproduction. So we ask that question, why are you here? If this is part of working out your salvation, you stop and you ask yourself, what's your purpose? Why are you here? And in that, you have to ask yourself this question, how do I accomplish that? Right? How do I accomplish that purpose? If I'm here for something that involves the gospel, that involves me and God working through me, how do I do that? And we stop right there for just a second. I'm going to ask 2 more questions. But before we do that, this is where most of us don't even ever get. Because we stop with salvation, we stop with trusting in Jesus, and we forget that there's a reason why God has called you to Himself. There's a reason. And we don't ever kind of think about, how do I accomplish the purpose? How do I accomplish what He's called me to? Is your purpose just to live and make money? Is that your purpose? Because I'll be honest with you, that's most people think it is. Most people in America think it's just to earn and have and build a legacy so that my kids, they don't have to struggle like I did. That's the American legacy. But that's not the purpose. I would actually say that begs this next question. I would say that's the obstacle to the purpose. So what keeps you from accomplishing your purpose? I think for most of us, it's having the wrong purpose. We focus on the wrong things. So if I'm to accomplish something, how am I supposed to accomplish that purpose? And what are the things that hinder me from accomplishing that purpose? And then finally, how do I overcome those things? If these are obstacles, how do I overcome those obstacles? That's the question. You know what? It's funny. We do this all through life. Whatever you truly want, this is what you're going for. I want to lose about 10 pounds. So what am I going to do? That's my goal. I'm going to think about what do I got to do to lose these 10 pounds. I'm going to make a list. I'm going to eat right. Start with my diet because diet's 80%. I'm going to go to the gym. That's another 20. Got 100%. Bam. Diet and gym. There we go. That's how I'm going to do it. What are the obstacles? My flipping laziness. I love to sleep. I love candy, and donuts, and food in general, and all things food. And then there's food. All right, so I've got these obstacles. I have to figure out a way to now overcome these obstacles. Because if not, this is where the dream dies. And has died for me for years, right? This is where it dies. I have to not only go past that, I have to go into the, how do I overcome that? It's not just about purpose, it's beyond purpose. Right? Keep looking at it. The next thing you're going to see is beyond the fruit is we do this. We do this working out our salvation with an attitude of reverence. Look at the last part of, look in Philippians there. Look at the last part of verse 12. He says, you work out your salvation with fear and with trembling. You ever thought about that when you read this text? Does God want you to be scared? Does God want you, as you're living your life, as you're bearing fruit, as you're working, using the grace that He's given you as the child of God to impact His world, does He want you to walk around like the other shoe's about to fall? That's not what He means. He's talking about a reverence, and here is why. Have you ever been, let's just say this, have you ever been to like a military graveyard? It's amazing. It'll change your life. Go to a military funeral sometime. It'll change your life. I went to, I think I mentioned this last week, I went to Omaha Beach on a vacation with Jolene one time. And we stepped in, you show up first and you walk into this huge memorial, big, beautiful, has the different the battles. Amazing. Normandy invasion on the wall and these granite and marble and just all these colors. It's amazing. And you walk from that, you walk into a sea of white tombstones, crosses, stars of David, just littered, and it's in perfect rows. And what's amazing is when you walk in there, as you walk into the place, there's not a word being said. It's eerily quiet. There's no signs out front that say, shh, please don't talk. Because nobody's talking. There's no person at the gate. Matter of fact, we walked in, I was like, am I supposed to pay something? I felt like I needed to do something to enter. Nobody was there. It's just open. And nobody's saying a word. It's deathly quiet. I didn't want to speak. I didn't want to groan. As me and Jolene are walking through it, we're out and by ourselves. We're in the sea of crosses. One of the coolest things, I walk upon a cross that says, known but to God. This soldier was known but to God. They didn't know who he was. And you walked in, you stand over it, and nobody's around me. And I turn to Jolene and I start talking like this. Nobody's there. But there's something about that place that compels me to be reverent. We leave the sea of crosses and the white tombstones, and we go down, and I walk down to the beach. I step out onto this. I couldn't believe how long the sand was. It just seemed forever to the water. And I thought, man, these guys have to walk across this. And I'm crying, just standing there. Because something has happened that caused me to be reverent and to think. And I was in complete submission to what was going on in that moment. Completely surrendered, completely trusted to what was happening in that moment. I was compelled. That's reverence. That's what we're talking about. In our everyday lives, the concept of working out our salvation with an attitude of fear and trembling isn't waiting for God to strike me down, but it's in complete surrender and complete trust that God knows what He's doing, and He's got me, and I'm okay, and we're gonna be good in the midst of this, and I can do what He's called me to do. That's the concept of reverence we're talking about here. The Bible says in Hebrews 12, the author, as he's describing who God is, the nature of the person of God, and he's trying to give us this almost a picture that would draw us into reverence. He says, therefore, since we've received this kingdom that can't be shaken, speaking of a God who is immortal, invisible, only wise, we've received a kingdom that can't be shaken. Let us show gratitude. I'm standing on a beach right now. I'm standing on a beach. How am I going to show my gratitude? I got nothing to give these dead soldiers. I can't put flowers on their graves. I don't have any little flags to put for them. Me and my wife, what do I do for these? How do I show these guys my gratitude? I just stand quietly. I stand in reverence. I look where I'm walking. I make sure I don't step on anything I shouldn't step on. I look for signs. Can I be on this grass? Can I smell this flower? What can I do? I'm completely surrendered. That's my gratitude to them, right? He says, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God acceptable service. Why? With reverence and awe. That's the idea here. So, we're working out our salvation, not working for our salvation. We're living in such a way that it bears fruit. Okay, so working out your salvation has something to do with the fruit that God is developing from you. And in the midst of that, our attitude is reverence toward Him. The next thing you want to see in this text, look at verse 13, is that God now does something. So we work out our salvation, but God works His will in and through us. So you see this juxtaposition. We do something, but God does something as well. Look at verse 13. For it is God who is at work. You work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God. This is the same sentence. This isn't two separate sentences. God is at work in you. What's He doing in you? He's changing something. He's working something. He's developing something. Look at the next part. Both to will, that's your desire, your will, your desires, and your work, your accomplishment, for His good pleasure. In other words, for His greatest glory. He's doing these things for His greatest glory. So there's two things I want you to see here. One in this text is that God is completely sovereign. He's 100% sovereignly in control. 100% sovereignly in control. Even though you and I have been given responsibility within our human lives, you're going to pay. I'm going to pay. There's consequences to what I do, good and bad, right? I'm going to receive or I'm going to pay. That's a fact. But God, it doesn't, just because I mess something up does not take away the control that God has. It doesn't take that away at all. All right? The Bible says in Acts 4, so Peter, the fellas, we've already had Pentecost, the Holy Spirit has descended. Peter and James have gone to the temple. They've healed a lame man. They've gone to prison for healing this lame man. And now they've gotten out of prison. And Peter gives this beautiful prayer to the Lord. And I want you to see this. Verse 27 and 28 of Acts 4, it says, "For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus." He's praying to the Father. "Against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed." Okay, you anointed Jesus, but there's gathered these people, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the people of Israel. And what are they there to do? Whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. So God's in control. In the midst of the persecution, God's in control. All right, so that's the first thing I want us to see. The second thing I want us to see is that God works in us to change our affections. He works in us to change us. We talked about the fruit of our lives. Well, the fruit of the Spirit working in us is a part of that change. Have you ever seen a movie that you didn't like? You ever seen a movie that you didn't like in the beginning? And then you watched it maybe a second time and you're like, oh, that's pretty funny. I don't know about you, I like to watch movies over and over again. So by the third time I was like, man, this is a great movie. I can remember going and seeing, this was many years back, the movie Napoleon Dynamite. I hated that movie. I went because I was a youth pastor and a bunch of my kids wanted to go, so we all went and saw the movie. And it was bad. But then, saw it a second time. And actually, well, this is really funny. There's some humor in here that I missed. And then by the time I saw it the third time, I'm quoting it. I'm like, get your own thoughts. You know, I'm quoting the movie, you know, vote for Pedro. I had a shirt. And I say that because there's things in our lives that we start off feeling a certain way, but then something happens that changes them. And I want you to know that in us, God is doing something. He's working for His great pleasure, and He's changing our desires. He's changing our affections. He's working in us just as the Philippians obeyed, as they surrendered. He's working in them. Galatians 5 says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. Why? Because these are the outworkings of God as He's changing our hearts. I don't know about you, but before Christ, all of us experience love at some level. But because of Christ, we experience love at a whole nother level. I don't know about you, but all of us before Christ had some version of self-control. But because of Christ, we have self-control on a whole different level. That's the fruit. That's the changing of our affections. It's like John Ball said as he was sharing his testimony. He trusted Christ. He was waiting for the change. I think you weren't even here and I shared part of your testimony. He was waiting for the change and it didn't feel different, and then something happened to him and he's like, there it is. There's the change. I would have done that differently before Christ. He changes our love. So we ask this question now. This is the next section of text, and it leads us into this. What happens when we think of ourselves less. So what's the result of this? So when we are in the process of working out our salvation, God is working in and through us. What's the result of that? He gives us three things I want to point out to us right here. The first thing is we live without something. We live without complaining. We live without arguing. I bet you, parents, I bet you one of the first moments that you noticed when your kid was maturing is when they stopped complaining about the food. You have kids? I don't know if you're like me. My kids, 9 and almost 6, dinner time shows up. Somebody is going to say something about what we're having. It's going to happen. It's religious. It's religious. It's like they show up and pay homage to the complaining God. Right? It's what we do. And what happens as your kid grows up? Right? Do they get to a place where they begin to accept? And they may not like it, but they stop saying things about it, right? That's the level. They're growing. They're maturing. So what happens with us? What is the result of this? What happens when we are working out our salvation and God is working in us? Well, there's this thing. He says, we begin to do all things. Look at the text in verse 14. We begin to do all things, he says. Do all things without grumbling. That's the word gongosmos. It means to murmur, to complain. Do all things without this or disputing. This arguing, that's fighting. The idea is that there's this now change that takes place. So you want to know what it looks like? What are the results of it? Well, we stop doing that stuff. Have you ever thought about what a complaint is? You ever file a complaint with somebody? The city? Your roads stink, I'm complaining. You know what that is? That's you wanting yours, right? You're complaining because you want to get yours. Itself is inserted here. You need a change for me. That's not all the time. Sometimes we're just trying to get to a level of truth. We're going to argue in order to have truth, but 95% of the time it's just me wanting to get mine. Have you ever been in an argument with your spouse? I'm 100% sure that you were in that argument with your spouse to make them a better person, right? It was all about them, your service to them, correct? No! You were arguing because you got hurt and you wanted to be right. See, what's the change being made here is all of a sudden now, it doesn't matter. You think Jesus... Man, would you have followed Jesus if we had a chapter in any one of the Gospels where Jesus stood up and said, you guys, I can't believe you're doing this to me. How dare you? I am the Son of God. And you're going to crucify me for that? Would you believe in Him? No. Because that's what humans do. That's what humanity does. That's the flesh. So what's the change? What's the result? Is all of a sudden the flesh now is beginning to be subdued by the Spirit of God that lives in us, right? Now there's no the complaining, the arguing, it doesn't matter. Because we're now on a mission. Again, just as Christ laid down His life, we also do the same. So that's the first thing we see here. Look at the next part of the text. The other result is that we prove in this to the world that we are children of God. It proves something. Just like the absence of that text in the Gospels proves Jesus is who He said He was. It proves it. You don't see His flesh. You don't see the fleshly reactions of, I'm going to get you for this. I'm going to come back from the dead, and I'm just going to... You don't see that because He's on a greater mission, and it proves who He is. Just the same way with us. When we set these things aside, when we set aside grumbling and complaining, and we accept the mission that God's called us to, and we keep our eyes on the ball, and we stop becoming distracted with self and all the things that are around us, all of a sudden, there's this outworking. The world begins to see us for who we are. Let's look at the text. This is verse 15. This is the first part of it. He says, you do these things without grumbling and disputing, so that you will prove yourself to be blameless and innocent. This is who you are. Regardless of how you feel about yourself, this is what God's grace has done for you. It's made you innocent. It's made you blameless because of the righteousness of Jesus Christ. You prove to the world to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and depraved generation. That's what happens. This is part of the outworking. Let's look at the third thing. The third thing that happens in this, and this is the end of verse 15. Into 16, he says, among whom? This crooked and depraved generation. Among them you are going to shine. You're going to appear as lights in the world. Stop right there for a second. We shine as lights in the darkness. That's the result. The result of this living every day out the gospel's effect in my life as I am working out my salvation and as God is working in me, the result is a shine. It's a shine. You just stand out. You glow. There's something about you that seems different. And guess what happens in a world that's dark? When something is light, people are going to come to it. They're going to be attracted by it. That's the point. We're going to draw men because of the light of Christ in us. Keep looking at the text. He says, you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life. Now, there's two ways to read this. I want to just point this out real quick. Holding fast does not mean, well, there's two ways to see it. You can see this as holding firmly to. Okay, the word is epekho, and it means either holding on to something tightly, in other words, holding fast the word of life, holding tightly or holding firmly to it, or there's another use of this word which means holding out, holding toward something. If it means holding towards something, it's again this concept of shining like stars. I personally think it's the second. I think that, and this is just me, but I think our English translation of this, and I've gone through the NAS, the NIV, the Holman, I've gone through a lot of them, the ESV, and all of them speak to holding tightly to something. I'll be honest with you, I think it's the other. Contextually, we're shining like stars, and where we are holding out this word of life, so that in the day of Christ I will have a reason to glory, because I did not run in vain nor toil in vain. That's our goal, right? You know, there's a book written by Mark Twain called The Prince and the Pauper. Do you know he wrote that? I didn't know he wrote it. I'd read it, didn't know it was him. It was one of his very first attempts at historic fiction. If you know the story, it's about Prince Edward. Prince Edward meets a boy outside of the palace. The boy's name is Tom. And the guards attack Tom, basically, and are trying to get him away from the prince. And the prince stops him and says, no, bring him here. And he ends up bringing the boy in, and they go into the palace. And the boy is just poor. He's a pauper. He's poor. He has nothing. And as they get into the palace, the prince realizes that this boy they look a lot alike. As a matter of fact, they were born on the same day. And they look identical. The only difference is one's the prince of the king, and the other one is his father's an abusive drunk. Just completely different worlds. Well, the prince is kind of fed up with the princeliness of his life, and he wants to experience something different. And the pauper's like, yeah, I'm sick of the beatings I keep receiving, so I'd love something different. So the two of them trade places. The prince takes off his clothes and he puts it on Tom, and Tom takes off his clothes and he put it on Prince Edward, and they go their separate ways. The prince lives as the pauper, and the pauper lives as the prince. And through circumstances, the king ends up dying, and so they're about to coronate the prince as the king. Well, the problem is that it's not the prince, it's Tom. And so Edward finally had enough. He had ran away from Tom's father and was living with a very kind man, and he goes back to the kingdom, and they attack him like they did Paul. You can't come in here. He says, no, I'm the prince. And Tom, who had been the prince, he was fed up with the prince life. So there had to be something that happened, because none of the people coronating believed that Prince Edward was the true prince. He can't be the prince. Look at him. He looks nothing like the prince. How can he be the prince? And so there was a problem. And so what the prince had done, which you find out now at the end of the story, is the prince had hid something. He had hid what is known as the Great Seal. And the Great Seal was this thing that whoever possessed it, whoever knew what it was, whoever possessed it, he must be royalty. And the whole time they've been asking Tom, where's the Great Seal? We're missing the Great Seal. Tom didn't even know what it was. But the prince had hidden it. So the prince goes. He grabs the Great Seal and he brings it in, and they all bow. This guy must be the prince. He has something different about him. That is the outworking of our everyday life because of the gospel. You and I have a great seal. Now the question becomes, are we going to hide it? Are we going to put it away somewhere so no one can see who the king is? So no one will know who we are in light of him. Is that what we do? No, not according to this text. We take that great seal and we show what we know. This is who we are, and this is what we've seen. And in turn, it proves who we are and who Christ is.